Hello, my name is Daniel Kipp, and I'm here to talk about my journey and the perspective I have as I have gone through the system of mental health and what I see are as problems and what I feel it needs in order to improve. I've been given the diagnoses of attention deficit disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, addiction, autism, Asperger's, and more. While I believe these diagnoses are accurate definitions of the issues that I have that have resulted in a lot of suffering in my life, I also feel there was a significant amount of suffering that occurred just because of the treatment those diagnoses called for. Let's see if this scenario sounds familiar. You're suffering, either physically, socially, academically. Your parents unable to find in their generalized textbook for raising children anything that matches what it is or what is expected in the normal population. They instead take you to see a professional who, after a battery of tests, conclude you either have something that can be defined as a mental illness, or, potentially even more frustrating, you don't have anything yet that could be defined as a mental illness, and thus you just have a whole lot of anxiety or stress that's causing you problems. But there's nothing actually wrong with you that they can put a name to. In either event, now that you have been analyzed to the best of their ability, you are thrown into what I define as the experimental or let's try this box, where you will be subjected to various treatments and medications until such time you believe that you are better off than you were before, or not. The typical system for this is to give you treatment A that shows the highest percent of success on the chart or whatever they're using. Observe the results. Then, if it doesn't appear to have the desired outcome for the person, you move on to treatment B, and then C, D, E, and so on. Then, if all of that doesn't work, you start mixing A and B. And you can go on for years doing this and never find the right combination. The undercurrent with all of this scenario is the fact at no point is an actual solution provided. Your behavior is modified, your symptoms are masked, you're given tools to cope, but the underlying idea is that you are broken. And a mind, once broken, can never be truly fixed. You may never get a reasonable explanation as to what is broken in the first place. So, why is it like this? My own personal theory is that in the early days of psychiatry, they did originally start out seeking a cause. They wanted to understand how the brain worked, only to discover that the human mind is a very complex thing, and that such effort at the time, back in the 1800s, it was an impossible task given the resources of the time. So, while research did continue to look for the how and why, psychology shifted more towards the idea that any solution was better than finding the right solution. It became a view of approaching psychological issues with the goal of fix it, while turning a blind eye to the how or why the fix actually worked. Trying to fix a problem without knowing what is wrong is something we actually do in almost all facets of our life. We experiment, we improvise, and when we hit upon the desired result long enough, or in some cases even once, we just run with it. The classic example of fixing things like this is the stereotypical smack it a few times and see if that helps. This is not hard to understand in some ways. Research takes money, and it takes time. And when you or your loved one is in pain, you don't always want the best solution. You just want a solution, either for you or for them. This was effectively my life story. Unofficially diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in the 5th grade by a student counselor, where there was a list of symptoms but no treatment. Having my attention deficit disorder not fit into the 3 major classifications to a high enough standard to actually qualify for any standard of attention deficit disorder were just a couple of the issues I had. I was run through drugs and therapies, and each session started with a new intake from myself, from my parents as to its effectiveness, and then finally, after one cocktail treatment after the other, I wound up on my own, on disability, and I had abandoned hope that there really would ever be anything that would help. However, science did not stand still. Neither did my parents, who, thankfully, never stopped looking for something. The steady march of time has opened new doors. How and why is no longer an impossible question to answer. And perhaps even more important is that due to the information gathered, people could actually not only answer to a certain degree how and why, but actually do something about it. What my parents discovered was something called neurofeedback, or EEG biofeedback. Neurofeedback is the process of looking at the electrical activity of the living brain, and then, while comparing its activity to other brains, yet respecting its uniqueness, attempts to encourage the brain to correct itself by prodding frequencies into the desired direction with classical and operant conditioning. This technique and its variants finally starts to fill in that big question mark of a gap, and what is being discovered is amazing. The best example I have for me is that of my attention deficit disorder. All my life I thought I knew what concentration was. It was behavior that brought out the best results academically. It was undistracted performance. Every school year, semester, it was the same. This time I was going to succeed. This time I was going to study and get good grades. And I would for 2 weeks, and then I would burn out. It was frustrating because I didn't understand why everyone else could keep it up. And obviously I could not. With neurofeedback, I had finally discovered why. Apparently what I had been doing, one might consider calling hyperfocusing. However, the focusing that everyone else was using to learn, I didn't even associate with a mental state of learning. When it was finally pointed out to me by a therapist who was treating me with neurofeedback. And suddenly, 20 years of frustration were revealed to me in an instant. It's something I would like to have been very angry about. The fact is, nobody from the wisest teacher to the most brilliant psychologist could have known that I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing inside my head because nobody could see inside my head. Through neurofeedback, I and my mind have learned to manage my stress, adapt to my autism, buffer and relieve my depression. All of this has allowed me to pull myself out of a barely functional state that I was in for a very long time. And I am right now on the verge of completing my bachelor's in psychology at EWU, or Eastern Washington University. I currently have a GPA of 3.69. All of this was done pretty much without any type of medication. Now, while I am obviously a big fan of neurofeedback, I am not advocating to the current system that it be abandoned solely in favor of it. I just believe that now that the big question mark of what is going on in the brain is being filled in, that the paradigm of psychology needs to shift. It needs to make room for examinations and treatments that see people as what they are, instead of this guesswork where you are just matching symptomologies to diagnoses instead of getting a picture of the brain itself and seeing if that actually matches. For instance, I did not get an official diagnosis of Asperger's/autism until after my first neurofeedback brain scan. The matching criteria for autism I did have overlapped with my attention deficit disorder, my obsessive compulsive disorder, and my depression. However, on my map, clear as day, was the left hemisphere hypercoherent or working really hard, with the right side hypocoherent, which was hardly working, which matched physical examples of other autistic people. There was no longer a guess or a symptomology matching. Now there was actually hard evidence. With data now gathered, both of the brain and its pathways, and the examined frequency shifts when exposed to various drugs, a full neurofeedback EEG scan by a trained professional can provide a more accurate decision as to which medications to try first, instead of statistically going down the list, A, B, C, D, E. A properly interpreted neurofeedback scan can help determine if a person is stressed because they are struggling with depression, or if they're depressed because they're under too much stress. I'm aware that change doesn't come easy. My journey, despite my massive improvements, didn't come easily either. It required a lot of patience and more than a few setbacks. However, the technology is there, and a society that deems itself enlightened shouldn't allow others to suffer unnecessarily because of ignorance. The tools are there. All that remains is for us to make the choice to use them.